my privilege to introduce our last speaker of the day, of the week, in fact, who is Professor John Wyatt, who is a Professor Emeritus of Ethics and Perinatology at University College in London. So his clinical background is as an academic neonatologist, so looking at beginning of life, but he's also been heavily involved in ethical issues at both the beginning and the end of life, and that's what he's speaking about today. And he has also just started working on a project at the Faraday Institute, collaborative project on the ethics of technology. So you won't be speaking about that today, but maybe in the future. So we look forward to your talk, John.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. So it's a privilege to be here, and I regard myself, I've spoken at a number of these courses, and I regard myself as a sort of soft underbelly of science. And so you have all your hard science stuff. Well, I do the human interest, ethics, soft, murky stuff. That's actually incredibly significant and important in today's climate. So my background, as you've heard, is as a baby doctor, a neonatologist. I spent most of my clinical life working in central London, working in an intensive care unit for very sick and very premature babies. Some of them go right down to the limits of viability, so out of a normal 40-week or 9-month pregnancy, I've often been caring for babies at 24, 23, even 22 weeks, 21 weeks and 6 days was the youngest baby that I ever cared for. And some of these babies are less than 500 grams and would literally fit in the palm of your hand. And it's a very technologically demanding and intensive kind of area. It raises all kinds of ethical issues. That's actually my hand and one of the babies on the baby unit. And one of my special areas of interest was in brain injury in newborn babies. It still is a matter of interest and research. I've been part of a big research group investigating mechanisms and prevention of brain injury. Increasingly, it's possible with technology to detect brain injury like this, bleeding into the brain. Instead, you can tell it's a very premature baby because the surface of the brain is smooth and it doesn't have the normal crinkles and wrinkles, the gyri and the sulci, which actually develop mainly in the last 3 months of pregnancy. So there's a huge amount of brain development taking place while the very premature baby is on the intensive care unit. We can detect brain injury increasingly precisely using a variety of techniques, including this, which is magnetic resonance imaging. But that's where the ethical questions become complex. If you know that the baby has got brain damage, would it ever be right to switch off the life support systems? And how do you make those kinds of decisions? Who should make those decisions? So it's a recurring theme in medicine is that as technology develops, it gives us more and more information. But how you use that information and the ethical challenges it raises is extremely complex and difficult. And just one floor away from the intensive care unit, where I spent a lot of time trying to ensure the survival of tiny little babies, is the fetal medicine unit. And here a large number of pregnant mothers from London and the southeast are referred, particularly if an abnormality of the fetus, the unborn baby, is picked up. And again, quite sophisticated technology is used. Ultrasound like this, amniocentesis, where fluid is taken from around the fetus, and then a number of genetic and other kinds of tests. And this is a test from a genetic test from an unborn baby. We know she's a little girl because she's got 2 X chromosomes, but she's got an additional chromosome 21. So this is trisomy 21, or Down syndrome. And we know that this child is going to be affected in some way if she survives. We don't know how severe it's going to be. It could be very severe and life-threatening. It could be relatively mild, but it would lead to some kind of problems. But in the UK and most places across the world, if this is detected before birth, then offered determination to have an abortion. And I wonder if you could estimate or guess what percentage of mothers in the UK in 2014 chose to have a termination when this particular pattern was found. What would you like to guess? 80%?
10%?
90%, that's about it. It's actually 92% is the figure. So more than 9 out of 10 mothers will choose to have an abortion. What I find also very troubling about this is that because the amniocentesis procedure itself carries the risk of causing a miscarriage, you can calculate that for every one baby who's detected with Down syndrome, so that an abortion can be offered, somewhere between 1 and 2 healthy babies will die as a result of the testing procedure. So here we as a society seem to be saying it's more important to risk the life of a healthy fetus in order that an abortion can be offered. And also, because of a strange quirk of the way the law works in the UK, it's actually legal for an abortion to be carried out for medical reasons, such as Down syndrome, at any stage in the pregnancy all the way up until term. And although the numbers are small, on a regular basis in my hospital, UCH in London, late abortions or feticides are carried out because of fetal abnormality at 24 weeks, 26 weeks, 28 weeks, 30 weeks, 32 weeks, even 36 weeks. Many times I've been called to go and talk to a woman, a pregnant mother, who is considering having an abortion. I've been called away from the neonatal unit where we're struggling to save some very premature babies. And the baby in her womb is considerably bigger and tougher and stronger than the one we're struggling to save 1 floor down. And then you say to yourself, how is it possible in one country, in one hospital, for these apparently totally contradictory activities to be going on? And I think the question itself is a very interesting and difficult question. There isn't a simple answer. How is it possible? How have we got here? But I think part of the answer is what philosophers call moral pluralism. We live in a society in which there is no one agreed philosophical basis for making these kind of ethical decisions. And there are many different competing ethical frameworks. And I've argued that in fact the ethical framework within the neonatal intensive care unit and the ethical framework within the fetal medicine unit are fundamentally in conflict. They are based on different understandings about what it means to be a human being and what is the value of a human life. So within the neonatal intensive care unit, the same kind of ethical framework is used in the rest of medicine, which regards life, human life, as having an intrinsic value, and therefore that each life has unique worth, and therefore we should do everything we can to ensure that life has the best chance of survival. In the fetal medicine unit is a different ethical framework which regards fetal life as a kind of potentiality, a potential person, a potential life. But therefore it is fundamentally open to question if that potential being has severe abnormalities, then it's better to end that life rather, or at least that is an option which the parents can consider. So it's interesting that this ancient argument about how much a baby is worth is actually not a new argument, and you can trace it all the way back 2,000 years, back to the classical era and the time of the early church. So the same argument was going on in the Greek-Roman world. Both abortion and infanticide were in fact very common, and they were based on this idea that human life had any potential value, it didn't have an intrinsic value. Interestingly, the early Christian church took a very different view, and they turned that into practical action by rescuing abandoned babies and by providing practical care even for very vulnerable and potentially dying babies. Some have gone on further and say that if you discover as a pregnant woman that your baby has particular abnormalities and is likely to be disabled or suffer, then actually you have a duty to have an abortion, a moral duty, to knowingly bring a child into the world when you know that the baby is going to be disabled is some kind of moral evil. And I've also heard some philosophers argue that, you know, if you know that your baby is going to be disabled and yet you choose to bring that baby into the world and the child is severely disabled, why should we, the rest of the community, have to care for that disabled child? Maybe you should be responsible for that care because that was your choice. But the rest of us shouldn't have to, quote, bear the burden of a child with disability. I want to say that I'm well aware that these are very painful and difficult and challenging topics, and I certainly don't have any easy answers. I don't think there are any easy answers to the sort of challenges that technology causes, but leads to, particularly in the world of healthcare. So, and I think that sometimes well-meaning people have talked about these kind of issues with harshness and rhetoric in their voices and done a great deal of damage. And you may have, if you're particularly from a Christian background, you may have heard sermons or things like that from pro-life groups or so on. So I think that we should talk about these issues. Ultimately, it seems to me, and from my experience, most medical ethical issues start as issues of human pain. And our first responsibility is to understand the pain, to empathise and enter into the pain. So if you like, we should talk about these issues with tears in our eyes, not with judgment and rhetoric in our voices. And of course the other thing is that I'm well aware that many of these issues that I'm going to talk about now are including issues at the beginning of life, like abortion and infertility, but also issues at the end of life, like dementia and old age and death and dying. These are issues that are not just out there in society, but actually in here in this room. I don't know anything about most of you, but yet I can guarantee that there are many people here who are touched, personally touched by many of these issues. So they're not just theoretical, philosophical, theological issues. These are very much personal, human issues which touch all of us in some way. Going back to the topic of abortion, it's interesting to see how the language and the rhetoric about abortion has changed since the Abortion Act was passed here in the UK in 1967. When the Act was first passed, the language, the discourse about abortion was very much as an extreme circuit, that it would only be available as an act of compassion in extreme circumstances. Then the rise of women's lib, feminism and so on, the rhetoric changes and now it becomes a question of liberation and a woman's right to choose. Now the rhetoric has changed again. Now the rhetoric is primarily in terms of social responsibility. It would be irresponsible to bring an unwanted child into the world, and now we have a duty to have abortion. So it's quite interesting to see how the rhetoric changes. If you think that that's complicated and difficult, it's actually going to get much worse as technology advances, and that is there is a new thing which is called non-invasive prenatal screening. It turns out that in any pregnancy, a small amount of fetal DNA is circulating in the mother's bloodstream. And therefore, by taking a simple blood test and by isolating the fetal DNA, you can effectively get a complete readout of the fetal DNA just from a blood test in a pregnant woman. At the moment, this is still a research project, although it's available commercially and it's being used commercially primarily for determining the parenthood of the fetus. There's a commercial company, you can get it on the internet, and it's the telephone number is "Are you my dad?" So, but it's also can be used for screening for fetal abnormalities, and that it's probably going to be rolled out within the NHS within the next 5 years as a routine screening tool. So imagine fast forward a few years and you or your partner or your daughter is pregnant and everything's fine and she goes to see the GP and she's referred to the hospital midwifery clinic and they say, we'd just like to do a blood test, check everything's all right. And then she goes back and they say, well, you know, congratulations, you're expecting a little girl, but unfortunately, we turns out she has a genetic variant, which means there's a 60% chance that she's going to get breast or ovarian cancer before the age of 60. There's also an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease and also type 2 diabetes. Do you think it would be responsible to bring this baby into the world, or do you think it would be better to have an abortion? And so you can just see the sort of dilemmas which ordinary people who've never faced anything like this before are going to be pitchforked into with this kind of information that is able to be obtained antenatally. And so this is being actively discussed at the moment. This is Scientific American, what fetal genome screening can mean for babies and parents, presenting new ethical quandaries. Another issue that some philosophers wrote in the Journal of Medical Ethics argued that actually the same kind of arguments that could be applied to abortion before birth could also be applied to a newborn baby. Exactly the same kind of moral arguments that which apply to the fetus apply to a newborn baby. And they said, therefore, that we could use the same arguments that we have for having an abortion for killing a newborn baby. So if the parents don't wish to have this baby, if it's inconvenient, or if the baby has an increased risk of disability, or if it's going to cause problems within the family for existing children. So they said, let's not call it infanticide, let's call it after-birth abortion. This paper was published and was picked up by one of our daily newspapers that's very well known for very thoughtful and detailed philosophical analysis. Some newspaper said, slaughter newborn kids, say academic. They got a sort of hate mail from around the world, and but it just shows you that these kind of philosophical questions about what it means to be a person and what the moral status is, these are real issues. These are not just theoretical issues. And behind this is a debate about what it means to be a person. What do we mean by a human person or a person at all? And several philosophers, including Peter Singer, have put forward a definition like this, that a definition of a person is a being who has the capacity for self-awareness and for making choices. Singer is what's called a preference utilitarian, so he believes that the supreme good, the supreme moral good, is helping persons to fulfill their preferences. But if you don't have any preferences, then you don't count effectively. You don't count as a person. So, by definition, a newborn baby can't be regarded as a person because it doesn't have any preferences. It doesn't even know it exists. And of course, the same is true at the other end of life for someone with severe dementia, someone with severe learning difficulties, brain damage, and so on, can't be regarded as a person. And so Singer would say, therefore, that to kill a newborn baby is equivalent to preventing a person coming to existence. In fact, he has argued, and would argue, logically, that really, morally, it's exactly the same as contraception. In contraception, you prevent a person coming to existence. In infanticide, you prevent a person coming to existence. The acts are morally equivalent. And you may think this is bizarre and ridiculous, but in fact, this is the sort of philosophy 101, which is taught in most of our high schools and in philosophy courses and so on. So this kind of thinking is actually amazingly effective. Singer is a very popular and good writer, and therefore his works are very effective. This is what he has to say about animals. There are many non-human animals whose rationality, self-consciousness, awareness, capacity to feel, and so on, exceed that of a human baby, a week, a month, or even a year old. An adult chimpanzee has more right to be described as a person than a newborn baby. I've sometimes wondered how the parents that I'm counselling on the neonatal unit might respond if I explain to them what Peter Singer thought about the value of their baby. But so sometimes these philosophers seem to live in a sort of alternative reality. And I like the quote that says medical ethics has become an adventure playground for philosophers. So it's a way of having all these wonderful thought experiments and ideas and so on, which seem often very divorced from the real human issues which practicing doctors and so what about the other end of life? Well, of course, again, our newspapers are full of cases where people have felt that it was right to take their own lives or the lives of others because they weren't worth living. This was just the latest one. It was just last month. Businessman Jeff Spector, he went to the Dignitas clinic in Zurich to take his own life. This is him on the right here. He had a tumour at the base of his spine. It wasn't causing him significant problems at this moment, but it was untreatable, and he'd been told that at some stage it would invade and press on his spine and lead to some form of paralysis and disability. And he just wasn't prepared for that. He'd had a very good life. He was a successful businessman, but he wasn't prepared to risk ending up in a wheelchair and disabled. So he told his family he had this final celebratory meal before he last supper, and then he went off to Zurich and took a lethal combination of drugs and died. And the newspaper headlines were basically pretty positive, and what a noble, responsible thing to do. He didn't want to be a burden to other people. He didn't want to cause difficulties. He did the honourable thing. And why on earth did he have to go all the way to Zurich and Switzerland? Shouldn't we have to change the law so this can be done here in the UK? And there have been a number of other high-profile cases. This is Daniel James, very popular and young sportsman. He was up in the English junior rugby team, very sporty and athletic, and then he was involved in a rugby accident, fractured his cervical spine, his neck, paralysed from the neck downwards. He became deeply depressed. His parents tried to talk him out of it and bought a whole load of equipment, but he didn't want to touch it. And he said to them, "If you really love me, you'll help me to kill myself." And in the end, they could dissuade him, and they travelled with him to Switzerland, and he took the lethal drugs and died. And again, the coverage was by and large in the press was positive. What loving parents, that they have put the best interests of their child first. And Baroness Mary Warnock defended and backed their actions, and she said it took courage to help for the parents to help their son to die. So there have been a whole number of high-profile cases like this, and the subplot is really to try and rehabilitate suicide as a noble and honourable way to die. That why should we think that suicide is a bad thing? Why should we oppose suicide? Actually, couldn't it be, in the right circumstances, something quite noble? Shouldn't the law be changed to allow doctors to help people commit suicide properly? Another factor which is causing a whole lot of concern is dementia and the rising epidemic of dementia, which is largely due to its improvements in lifespan and longevity, because dementia, the chances of getting dementia is very closely related to how old you are. As we have more and more elderly people, then the risks of dementia go up, and these are predictions. 800,000 people with dementia in 2012, this is just in the UK, a million in 2021, 1.7 million in 2015. So people are looking at this horrific epidemic and saying, well, perhaps some form of mercy killing, some form of suicide would be a solution. And is somebody with severe dementia, can we really say that they're a human being? Well, we say they're a human being. Can we say they're a person? That they're the same, a member of society? Or have they in some way, can we see them as something different? And then Mary Warnock, again, a very distinguished moral philosopher. If you're demented, you're wasting people's lives, your family's lives, and you're wasting the resources of the NHS. I'm absolutely fully in agreement with the argument that if pain is insufferable, then someone should be given help to die. But I feel there's a wider argument that if somebody absolutely desperately wants to die because they're a burden to the family or to the state, then I think they too should be allowed to die. So if you know that you're going to be a terrible burden to your children and to your family and to the state, well then isn't it a noble thing to do, an altruistic thing to do, to take your own life and not to cause problems for your loved ones? As you probably know, there's a whole very active debate going on in the House of Parliament about whether or not to change the law to allow some kind of doctor-assisted suicide to come in. And So these are the age-old ethical issues of to do with the destruction of human life. The interesting thing is that these issues were, as I said, very alive 2,000 years ago at the dawn of the classical era and the dawn of the Christian era. They're not new. Both abortion and euthanasia was very common at the time of Christ. And they continue to be very real issues. However, there are other issues to do with technology and so on, and these are genuinely new bioethical issues. These have been created by advances in technology. And these are not to do with the taking of life, they're to do with the making, the shaping, and the faking of life, to put it in a rather slick way. It's not original. And they include these things like reproductive technology, smart drugs, enhancement technology, man-machine merging, and artificial intelligence and robotics. And I really haven't got time to go into this in any kind of detail, although, as you heard, this is now a major research interest of mine, which I'm going to be continuing looking at what the implications are, what it means to be human of these artificial intelligence and robotics. When I was a medical student, an awful long time ago, I went to a lecture on how to make a baby. This was back in the 1970s, and what I learned was that in order to make a baby, a man and a woman had to have sexual intercourse, and then 9 months later I popped a baby, and I wrote it all down very carefully in my notebook. So I'd actually worked that much out already. But if you go to a lecture these days, you'll have a rather different story. So in order to make a baby, you need to have an egg donor, and you need to have a source of eggs, you need to have a source of sperm, you need to have a womb, a uterus, somebody to put the embryo in, and you need to have someone who will care for the baby. But there's absolutely no reason why any of these 4 variables should have any relationship. And so all the permutations and combinations, you can have egg donation, sperm donation, surrogacy, and so on. And in fact, it's perfectly possible to go onto the internet and construct a baby and choose up from these 4 criteria, and you can give your credit card details and obtain sperm, you can obtain eggs, you can hire a surrogate mother, and that have been cases where this is a so-called Google baby. So technology is changing the nature of what it means to be a parent. And just one example, again, a very recent example, where a daughter was dying, and she wanted desperately to have a baby, and she wanted her mother to have her eggs in order to have her own child after she died. And this went all the way to the court because the only question the court were interested in was whether the consent that the daughter had given for the use of her eggs was valid. In other words, the court was not interested in whether the grandmother was carrying the mother's eggs and so on, and what the confusion and possibilities would be for the child. The only question the court gave was the consent valid. In fact, the court decided the consent wasn't valid. They couldn't be certain that the daughter really did want her eggs to be used like this. And so they didn't approve of the use of the frozen eggs. But again, it just shows the sort of complexities and complications and ethical challenges which this kind of technology brings. And I came across this quote recently, which rather struck me, from a professor at Stanford Law School. Within the next 20 to 40 years, it is likely that the majority of babies in developed countries will be conceived in IVF clinics and receive whole genome sequencing as embryos before being selected for transfer to the womb. In other words, the prediction, whether that's right or not, I don't know, but the prediction is that actually this will be seen as the desirable way to have a baby, because you have access to the embryo, you can screen the baby effectively, and you can therefore select, and if necessary, manipulate the embryo in the way that you want. So you can have the child that you choose rather than the child that you're given. And this is, again has got a whole lot more complicated by the recent announcement that embryo editing, so-called, or modification of the human embryo is possible using new, very powerful DNA technology, which enables one to be very selective about snipping out a particular region or a particular base pair and changing it to another base pair. And this has already been done in human embryos in China, although as far as we know there's no living child as technically possible, and this has led to a whole new debate about whether or not we should restrict this kind of procedure, or whether it's going to happen anyway, and therefore we just have to accept that editing of the human embryo is something that's here. And just other examples of this is examples of how human machine technology, this woman has severe disability, which means she's not able to use her own arms, but by having a brain implant, she's able to then control, just by thinking, the movements of this hand, mechanical hand, and so on. And so you can see that this kind of technology, the ability to control machinery just by thought alone, has great potential for the lives of disabled people. But there's also a huge amount of work going on by the military, particularly the US military, learning how to use so that pilots and soldiers will be able to control planes and control weapons simply by thinking. So this kind of technology, so-called dual-use technology, it always has value in medical use, but it also has military and other applications. And similarly, the US military is funding the development of memory implants, and they say they're doing this because of injured soldiers who've had brain injury and memory problems. But of course, it doesn't take a genius to see that if you work out the technology of how to put implants into human brains, you could put this into the brain of a soldier and give access to soldiers' memories and skills that they haven't had. Sounds increasingly like the Matrix, if you think the Matrix, where the person uploads the skill to fly a helicopter and then they're able to fly that. And it is interesting that a lot of this is being funded by the US military. The biggest funding of human enhancement technology on the planet is the US military, and so-called DARPA. C.S. Lewis said in the dark days at the end of the Second World War, man's power over nature turns out to be power exerted by some men over other men. In other words, whenever we talk about the disinterested power over nature, actually so often what we're talking about are human power structures. And it's the strong and the powerful who gain power and use technology to exert over the weak and the vulnerable. And just finishing the roundup, 3 of these beings are human beings and 3 of them are robots. And there's actually a YouTube video where they're all sitting around the table and having a conversation, and as the camera spins around, it's very difficult to work out who the humans are, who are the robots. The rise of the robot security guards. So this is going to become, something like this is going to become a pretty commonplace sight in shopping malls and in various parts. So artificial intelligence security guards are going to come. And there appears to be no physical limit to the potential processing power of intelligent machines. So whereas biological enhancements or putting wires into brains is always going to be limited by physical problems and physical laws, the interesting thing is that once you're dealing with ones and noughts, there doesn't seem to be any physical limit to the processing power that's available. And in fact, because of Moore's law, there's a effective doubling of computer power every 18 months. As people project forward into what the potential power of this technology is, it's fairly scary. So this is an interesting book by Nick Bostrom, a philosopher called Superintelligence, which is all about the dangers of really high intelligence machines. And he just draws this is intelligence along here. You have a mouse, you have a chimpanzee, you have the quote village idiot, and then you have Einstein. And this is how far we've got so far. But of course, what we've got along here is the potential of superintelligence. And if this thing out here is the difference between the chimpanzee and Einstein is not very much. And of course, then people say that, and how do we know whether this thing is going to be friendly, whether it's going to treat us as an irrelevance or possibly as a threat? And so there are people saying that actually artificial intelligence now represents a major existential threat for the future of mankind. So we've got climate change, we've got asteroids, but we've got a new one. It's artificial intelligence. And Stephen Hawking and others have gone. Now, I'm not necessarily thinking they're right, but it's just interesting to see this kind of dystopic fears are some pretty reputable people now starting to look at that. So, how earth do we think about these things from from the standpoint of a theological position? I'm speaking as a Christian believer and putting some Christian responses to this, but of course, I think people from many different religious traditions have tried and are continuing to grapple with this. I think one of the interesting things is that in historical thinking and in philosophy, these three categories of being were seen as entirely separate. There were human beings, there were animals, and there were machines. What's happening is that, firstly, this barrier is increasingly blurred. So we're just carbon-based life forms, we have the same kind of DNA, have the same kind of brain, we're basically primates with a bit of extra frontal cortex compared with chimpanzees. So there's blurring here, and then there's blurring here. What's the difference between the human brain and a computer? I mean, this is just a computer made out of meat, as Marvin Minsky said, and in fact computers made out of silicon are probably going to work out to be better in the long run. In fact, there are some people saying that actually the machines are going to be our real children of the future. Our flesh and blood children are always going to be limited and have all the problems of being made out of meat. But our real children are going to be our mind children, and they're going to be our artificial intelligences. And already these artificial intelligences are spreading out beyond the solar system, exploring the world, but just wait and see what our future mind children will achieve. So the blurring of these categories means that what it means to be human is increasingly something that seems to be lost. So from a Christian perspective, Christian ethics, the way we treat one another, comes from Christian anthropology, the way we're made. And so one of the requirements, therefore, is to develop a creation theology of humanity, to understand more about what it means to be human. And one of the foundational things about Christian thinking about humanity is that we are not original. In fact, we are derivative. We're not self-explanatory. We are reflections. We are made in God's image, and therefore we are reflections of another reality. We derive our meaning from outside ourselves, rather like a map is representation in one form of a completely different reality in a different format. In the same way, we can think of Homo sapiens as being some kind of map made out of flesh as a carbon-based life form that actually reflects the being and reality of another kind of being entirely, which is the person being God himself. And that means that the structure of our humanity and the values and purposes of our human lives will only make sense in the light of our godlikeness and the light that we're created in God's image. However much you analyze human DNA, however much you look at human neuronal functioning, you'll never understand what it means to be human unless you understand that in some wonderful and bizarre way we are maps. We are derivative. And our dignity and significance, therefore, comes not from our mental function, but from our godlikeness. And yet, what the biblical narrative is very clear about is that we're also made out of dust. I mean, did you know that Adam, the Hebrew human, is derived from Adamah, the ground? And in fact, same in human, that human is derived from humus. Not that nice stuff you put on pita bread, but the compost heap. That's what is in our name. We are groundlings. And we are, what is interesting is in the creation narrative in Genesis 2, and I know you've already had Ernest Lucas talking about this, is that this seems to be part of the design. We are designed to be made out of the same stuff as everything else. And therefore, our limitations, our dependence, we're designed to be physical, dependent, frail, vulnerable, and to use the philosophical word, contingent. So, as I stand here talking to you, my life holds by a thread. It would only take a minute, tiny microscopic clot to float into my coronary artery, and I would suddenly have a cardiac arrest and collapse to the ground and die unless someone jumps on my chest. It would only take a tiny little bit of platelet clot to go up a carotid artery, and I have to have a major stroke and suddenly be unable to speak, unable to move my arms. It would only take tiny change in my neurotransmitters, and I would suddenly become psychotic, or hallucinate, and lose contact with reality. So my life hangs by a thread. I am utterly dependent on contingent chance events. And you know what the Christian narrative says? This is design. This is the point. We are designed to be vulnerable and frail and fragile and dependent. And of course that's a profoundly countercultural idea in a modern liberal society that prizes autonomy and choice and preference as for those. So dependence is not an alien, a subhuman and undignified condition. It's part of the narrative of every human life. You came into this world utterly and totally dependent on the love of somebody else. And you wouldn't be sitting there unless somebody cared for you, somebody kept you warm, somebody fed you, and somebody wiped your bottom. Otherwise, you wouldn't be sitting there. You could do nothing for yourself. And you know what? Most of us are going to end our lives utterly and totally dependent on the love and care of others. And we can do nothing for ourselves. And this was brought home to me very strongly in an incident I've often spoken about. My mother, who was a very vivacious, intelligent lady, was struck down by a horrible form of dementia, and in front of our eyes she was transformed into someone who was dependent, confused, hallucinating. She was doubly incontinent. She could do nothing for herself, and she was having 24-hour nursing care. And near the end I was visiting her and somebody thrust a yogurt pot and a teaspoon into my hand, and I was trying to feed her. Open your mouth, here it comes, open your mouth, open. And then I suddenly had a flashback. This was precisely what she had said to me and how she had fed me. In fact, I could even remember her words as she was feeding me. And now the tables were turned. And I remember thinking at the time, you know, this is the way it was meant to be. I was learning more of what it meant to be a son. And she was learning more about what it meant to be a mother. Because dependence is part of the narrative. It's part of the story. And it's part of the deep mystery of what it means to be human. And I think, therefore, trying to find analogies, it seems to me that very often the secular and naturalistic understanding of what it means to be human is a bit like a Lego kit, where, you know, Lego, you can put the bricks together in any way you like because there is no fundamental order. The only limitation is in your own imagination. But I think within a Christian understanding, humanity, a human person, is much more like this, which is a flawed masterpiece. You can tell it's a masterpiece. It's actually by Holbein, from the Dutch masters called the Ambassadors. It's in the National Gallery in London, but as you can see, it's had a lot of damage. But despite the damage and the flaws, you can still see the original artistic intent of the author, of the painter. And interestingly, the art restorers have a code of ethics like doctors, and part of the code of ethics of art restorers is that they must only use their technology for the intention of, in accordance with the artist's original intention. They are not allowed to use technology to make it better, to enhance. They are only to use technology according to the artist's original intention. And so the art restorers at the National Gallery use a whole lot of high-tech methods, including X-rays, to try and work out exactly how Holbein has intended this masterpiece to be. And then they use sophisticated artificial paints and polyurethane glosses and all kinds of things to reproduce what the artist had originally intended. If you go to the National Gallery now, this is what you'll see. Now, it seems to me that's some kind of analogy for how the appropriate use of technology for human beings. In other words, the issue is not the technology, the issue is how is it being used. Is it being used to restore the masterpiece, or is it being used to change the design? And that is, in a simplistic sense, the difference between what is often called restorative therapy and enhancing therapy. And it's not a straightforward issue, and there's a grey zone in between where we're trying to work out if something restorative and something enhancing is often very difficult. You'd like to discuss that further, I'd be happy to discuss that further. But nonetheless, in principle, I think that distinction is a helpful distinction, and one that I would support. What about understanding the development of a human fetus? So this is what you look like when you were born. This is what you look like when you were 28 weeks. This is what you look like when you were 18 weeks. This is what you look like at 6 weeks. This is what you look like at 3 weeks. And this is what you look like at 3 days. You did. You look exactly like that. And it's interesting just to think, if that's me, as I go back in my own life history, is there any point at which I can say confidently that is not me? And I personally don't think there is. I think even when you look like this, that was you. And interestingly, if you think of the language of the psalmist in Psalm 139, of course the psalmist had no idea of this, but he says, your eyes, speaking to God, saw my unformed being every day was written in your book before one of them came to be. So I don't think there's any point as we go back in human origin at which we can confidently say there isn't a person there. Now, again, we're dealing with controversy, and I know this has been a matter, and is still a matter of painful controversy between Christians and other religious people. But it seems to me that one of the fascinating things about Christian theology is that it makes the astounding claim that God himself, the God of the cosmos, the God of total power, becomes a fetus, and a real fetus, not just a pretend fetus, and a real baby, not just some cherub on a Christmas card, but a real baby with pain in his tummy who squirts down his mother's back. And yet, that there's some profound mystery in this, so that the God of the universe makes himself totally dependent, and he can do nothing for himself, and he cannot feed himself, and he cannot care for himself. He is utterly and totally dependent. And at the end of his life, stretched out on the cross, through parched lips, the God of the universe says, I am thirsty. And he can do nothing for himself. So, and yet, what the Christian faith teaches, and again, it's a scandalous claim, is that the very moment of total dependence, while he's having his bottom wiped in Bethlehem, he is still the second person of the Trinity, upholding the universe by the word of his power. So in other words, his dignity and his status are in no way touched by his dependence. And that is an incredibly important message. And could you please remember this, that at some time in your life, it's very likely that you too will find yourself in a hospital bed or in some other situation, and you need to be fed, and you need to be watched, and you need to have your bottom wiped. But despite whatever happens to you, your unique status and your unique dignity is in no way touched. You are still the person that God knows and loves and has called into existence. So dependence, so that in the mystery of the incarnation, God actually enters into the experience of dependence and teaches us about it. And as one theologian put it, he was with us in the darkness of the womb, as he will be with us in the darkness of the tomb. There's no phase of human existence that we can go through which in some sense God himself has been there as well. And there's this amazing incident which Luke the physician writes down in the first chapter of Luke. For those of you who know the Bible will know the story. Mary has just heard the angel tell her that she's going to have a child, and Mary takes a deep breath and says, I am the bond slave of the Lord, let it be to me as you have said. In other words, I say yes. And then she runs along a journey to go and visit her cousin, Elizabeth. And then Luke records this phenomenon that as Mary is running into and calling Elizabeth's name to tell her this great news, the baby within Elizabeth, pregnant Elizabeth's womb, leaps for joy, and Elizabeth is filled with the Holy Spirit and says, Blessed are you, Mary, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And how can it be that the mother of my Lord, the mother of my Lord, has come to me? That sound your greeting, baby, my womb leapt for joy. And you can actually work out, roughly, where these unborn babies are. Elizabeth is pregnant with John the Baptist, and he's about 7 months old. In other words, this is John the Baptist leaping for joy. And where is Jesus? And the answer is, he's there. He's about 3 weeks gestation. He's probably 5 weeks, 5 weeks the Holy Spirit says, the mother of my Lord. Isn't that mind-blowing? It's scandalous, it's strange, and yet that's the mystery of what it says. So that I've stared at this slide many times, and I've thought, for me, where is God in this slide? Am I this tiny little hand, and God is this huge, great hand that is supporting me? And yes, that's true. There have been many occasions in my life when I felt like this tiny, desperate little hand clinging on, and God is this great hand. But astonishingly, you can spin the image round, and God chooses to make himself vulnerable. He chooses to make himself a little hand. He chooses deliberately the path of vulnerability and dependence in order to teach us the dignity of dependence. So, I'm coming to the end. In Orthodox Christian thinking, we should defend the preciousness of every human life. This is the form in which God became flesh. So, the idea of the incarnation gives a special dignity and significance to this kind of meat, as Martin Winsky would put it. And even, therefore, the most fragile and vulnerable little baby is one that we should treat with respect, not just with compassion and care, but actually with respect, because they too are a human being made in God's image. They too are made out of the same stuff. So dependence, fragility, vulnerability, contingence, these are all part of creation designed for human beings. And interestingly, in Christian, Orthodox Christian theology, even in the new creation, we will be resurrected and raised in a physical form. We will never lose our creature dependence. We will remain dependent even in the glories of the new creation. And therefore, I think one of the messages of Christianity is that we must resist this controlling tendency of the age to master and control our own human nature. It seems to me that that's one of the foundational philosophical goals of all technology, is about mastery of nature and mastery of human nature. We see this very strongly in the Enlightenment understandings of using technology to master as a form of mastery. And I think we have to recognize there are limits to how much we can master ourselves. Why? Because we are dependent, we are reflections, we are a different kind of being. But whenever we say that something is wrong, we must immediately go on to say, and here is a better way. I think in Christian church, a great deal of damage is done by preachers who go on and say it's wrong, it's bad, it's wicked, you mustn't do it, it's bad, it's wrong, it's bad, it's wrong, it's bad. That is really unhelpful. And I think whenever we say that something is wrong, we must immediately go on and say, well, here is a better way. So if we feel that the wholesale destruction of unborn fetuses is inappropriate, what is a positive way? Well, here's an anecdote, a real life story. Some very good friends of ours, Alan and Verity, used to go to the same church we go to in central London. They got married and were desperate to have a child, and then she told us this wonderful news. She was pregnant, and we had a celebratory meal together. And then it all turned tragic because she had scans, she had genetic tests, and it turned out that this baby had Edwards syndrome, which is like Down syndrome, only much worse, and is universally lethal. In these situations, nearly every doctor and everybody would advise to have an abortion. Why on earth would you go through the whole of the pregnancy and go through childbirth and all that? Why put yourself through it? And why put the baby through it? Surely the loving and compassionate thing to do is to have an abortion. Alan and Verity wrestled and grappled with this, but in the end, they said, this is the baby that God has given us, and we must love and care for this baby, whatever happens. And so little baby Christopher was born. He had all the signs of Edwards syndrome. Interestingly, the hospital where he was born hadn't seen a baby with Edwards syndrome because so many of them had been aborted. They hadn't actually seen a baby with Edwards syndrome for years. And little baby Christopher didn't die straight away, and in fact they used to bring him along to church at All Souls in the central of London, where he became like a mini celebrity. And he was the smallest member of the church family. He was 2.5 kilos. But he used to get passed from arm to arm at the services, and he was a very placid, quiet baby, and everybody just longed to give him a cuddle. And he was easily one of the most famous members of the church family. And in fact, he lived for 7 months. And then he got weaker and weaker, and he died quite peacefully at home. And when he died, he was exactly the same weight as when he was born. He was still 2.9 kilos. And a memorial service was held at All Souls, and over 400 people turned up to pay tribute to this tiny, pathetic little brain-damaged baby. And one of Alan and Veritas' friends said, you know, although Christopher couldn't grow, he helped other people to grow. And so, in a strange, wonderful way, even Christopher was a godlike being, was made in God's image. He was a flawed masterpiece. And his life was valuable and significant and touched many others. And at the time, I was wrestling with sort of the ethics of abortion. It just struck me, this is Christian theology in action. This is what it actually looks like, where you treat even damaged and brain-damaged babies with respect. Yeah. And Joseph Piper, a Catholic philosopher who I found very, very insightful and interesting person to read, he has these words: love is a way of saying to another, it's good that you exist, it's good that you're alive. The trouble with abortion and suicide and euthanasia is it says it's bad that you exist. It would be much better for the world if you didn't exist. But Christian love always says it's good that you exist, it's good that you're in the world. So my wife actually runs a Christian charity called the Crisis Pregnancy Centre. It's called Choices. It's in the centre of London, and they offer free, compassionate counselling and support for women with an unplanned pregnancy, and they also provide support for women who've had abortion, traumatised, and partners. And they're not involved in campaigning. They're not involved in trying to persuade people. They simply provide compassionate, non-judgmental support and love. But I see this again as a better way of responding to the issue of abortion in our society. And then what about euthanasia? Well, the wonderful thing is that over the last decades, there's been remarkable advances in the care of dying people. And a lot of it's actually been pioneered by Christians. So this lady, Sister Saunders, is a very well-known Christian physician who specialised in the care of the dying and really almost single-handedly invented a completely new way of caring for dying people. One of her great slogans was, you don't have to kill the patient in order to kill the pain. And you matter because you are you, and you matter to the end of your life. Not only will we help you to die well, we will help you to live before you die. So to live before you die became one of the great slogans of palliative care. And again, I see this as a better way, an alternative to euthanasia. So I'm going to stop there. If you'll allow a bit of terrible self-publicity, there's this book, Matters of Life and Death, which goes into many of the issues I've been talking about in greater detail. But thanks so much for listening. I'm very happy to answer questions.
Very good, thank you, John. Are there any questions? Yes.
Firstly, thank you for extraordinarily good talk. In terms of, I completely agree with that love is a way of saying to a person, it's good that you exist and it's better for the world that you do. How do we then, as Christians, or in the Christian faith, do we approach it when people feel themselves that it's better for them if they don't exist?
Well, it's a complicated question. And of course, there are very different scenarios, and part of the whole challenge about Christian faith and Christian ethics is that every situation is unique. And although there are some fundamental principles, how you apply the principles to any one particular principle. So, for instance, one of the commonest reasons why people say that is because of severe clinical depression. And in fact, it's well known, it's one of the diagnostic criteria of depression, is a desire to kill yourself. Suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation is part of being depressed. And I have to be honest and say I went through a period of severe clinical depression myself, and I can remember vividly thinking perhaps it would be the best for myself, the best for my family and for everybody if I could just end my life. So suicide said, I was met with love and with therapy and with care and compassion and healing. So interestingly, there are people arguing that if you're depressed and it doesn't respond to treatment, then you do have the right to suicide. But I and many others feel that's wrong, and that therefore, one of the things that palliative care is quite common when people are facing death and know they're dying, is they just say, why wouldn't you kill me? Just end it all. Just end it. What palliative care doctors know is that often these feelings come and go. The following day, once the pain relief is working well, someone wakes up and says, what's for breakfast? And what palliative care doctors say is that what they have to do is to answer the question behind the question. So the real question is, why do I feel so terrible? Do you still care for me? Are you abandoning me? And what you need to answer is that question, not why won't you kill me? Having said that, I strongly believe that just because we have a high view of human life and of the value of human life, that doesn't mean that everybody should have every possible treatment right to the end of life. And actually, there is a time to say enough is enough. There is a time to say I don't want any more treatment, and I don't want to be put in the intensive care unit, and I don't want to have any more anti-cancer medicines. And because in Christian thinking, death is not always an enemy. One of the interesting things about Christian theology is it actually has a sort of interesting ambivalence about death. On the one hand, death is an enemy, and life is precious. But on the other hand, there are situations where death can change from being an enemy into a sort of strange kind of healing, strange kind of gateway into the new heaven and the new earth. And so there is a time to say enough is enough, and it needs wisdom and judgment to know at what time to say I want to carry on, and what time to say it's time to say goodbye, it's time to stop. So these issues are complex and nuanced. One of the interesting things, there was a study done coming out of the States where they took a large group of people, all of whom were diagnosed with terminal cancer and were likely to die within the next year. And they divided those into those who used, quotes, religious coping, for whom religious values were very important in the way they coped with their own death, and those who didn't use religious coping. And they then followed them to see what would happen over the following year. What they found was that the people who said they used religious coping, most of whom in the US would actually be Christians of some form or other, were more likely to die on the intensive care unit, having futile treatment. They were less likely to die at home. They were less likely to have a do not resuscitate order. They were less likely to have nominated someone else to make decisions on their own. They were more likely to have futile medical treatment. So paradoxically, many religious people, it actually leads them to over-treatment. So I think my take-home message from that is there are a lot of people who are deeply confused about understanding an approach to dying and whether that is
Okay, so we have a question just...
This is not so much a question as a little statement really, and the statement really is around your wife's charity or what have you. Choose it. I have two adopted children. One's Filipino, one's from South Korea, both from Christchurch actually were over. And in fact I've got married little souls, so there we go. I'm a physician actually in infectious diseases. But when we went through this adoption process, we were really thrilled with our parents. But there is a real issue around the lack of knowledge of the number of people out there who would love to become parents. In fact, I don't know, 1 in 10 people who actually have problems with fertility. You'll know the numbers much better than me. And I'm not sure that's really fairly put to women, that there are actually terrific opportunities for babies that you may not feel you can cope with, but there are actually people out there who would love to be involved. And I guess that's partly what your wife is doing.
It is.
And I'm just sort of glad that that's happening and I'd like to applaud it really.
Well, I totally agree with you, and of course it does seem from the outside, and I've seen many cases where adoption has been a wonderful answer both for a childless couple and for somebody facing unwanted pregnancy. And I myself, I've often counselled women carrying an abnormal fetus who are considering having an abortion, always discuss the option of adoption. However, what I have to say is that the commonest response you get, so you talk through the possibility of carrying on the pregnancy and what that might involve, you talk through abortion and the possibility of ending the life and what that might involve, and then you discuss the possibility of adoption. The commonest response you get is, oh, doctor, what a terrible thing to suggest. I could never do that. That's awful. I mean, so to give your baby to someone else, the strange things happen in our society is that is seen. You can happily think about, not happily, but you can consider destroying the life of your baby. But the idea of giving your baby to someone else seems very strange. And I think it's one of the sad things that's happened in cultural sort of mores, that this attitude, this view towards adoption. I'm afraid a lot of it is a sort of rather narcissistic preoccupation with me and my own feelings, and this horrible word closure. If I have an abortion, yes, it's terrible and it's sad and it's awful, but at least it's gone. But the idea that I'm going to live the rest of my life knowing that somewhere is my daughter, and not knowing how she is, and not knowing where she is, and not knowing what she thinks of me, and not knowing what's happening to her, and I'm going to have to live the rest of my life like that. For many people, they regard that as impossible. You know?
Can I just make a comment back again? Sorry to take much time, but when my wife and I went through this, there was a lot of information put up that was from old studies, which demonstrating a poor outcome for children. However, the later data, which actually came from the large Christchurch cohort, showed that by any measure, adopted children have better outcomes for suicide, for employment, for educational attainment, or whatever, because I suspect it's partly because the marriage survives that, then the child is really, valued, and there are other things that go on. So it bothers me that sort of mythology that sort of exists and isn't counted. But secondly, the notion around what an adoption is quite different now from what it was.
Yes.
And you may well have involvement with the mother and all sorts of things.
No, that's absolutely true. And these are all things that we do feedback. So sadly, I think the truth is it isn't the bad studies, the bad outcomes in early studies, which really stops people. It isn't that. It is much more me and how I'm going to cope, and the sort of narcissism that in the end it's all about me. I'm afraid that these attitudes become very, very dominant in modern society.
So who's we've got several hands. Let's start right at the back.
Thank you for the lecture, and I would like to know you presented what was it called again? Genome modification, or that you can modify the genome of a fetus. And I would like you to know your stand on that.
So this is what's now being called embryo editing.
Embryo editing.
And it's only really quite a recent, because although the concept has been around for a long time, because it was never technically possible, it's something which people haven't seriously considered. Now it's becoming technically possible. It's actually creating a huge amount of concern and controversy. And from a Christian point of view, there's been actually very little Christian reflection on this. See, paradoxically, if the alternative is destroying embryos, you could argue that it was more in line with art restoration to edit the embryo, or for instance to edit baby Christopher while he was an embryo, so that he returns to a normal genome, that this is art restoration, and it's better than destroying the selective pre-implantation diagnosis. On the other side is the fact that you are taking onto yourself the sort of creative possibilities which up until now are something that only God himself has known and been in providential control over, and in particular that when any editing that you make of the embryo will be passed down. It's a germline modification, so it will be passed down to the next generation and on to the next generation and on to the next generation, and so potentially you are making modifications to the entire human germline. And genetic scientists up until now have put germline modification as a sort of line in the sand. So if you do somatic cell modification, it will always end when that person dies. But once you start editing embryos, then it's a different ballpark. So the honest answer is, I think there's a deep amount of controversy and further reflection required. It's interesting, isn't it, thinking about baby Christopher, because part of the issue about genomic, if we changed baby Christopher's embryo at an embryonic stage so that he became 46XY, would he still be baby Christopher? Or are we, is his identity in some way partly framed by his genetics? And so I think these are deep and profound questions which I don't have a simple answer
Roger.
On your point about there comes a time in some scenarios where enough is enough, I think that was the way you put it, which I think was put very, very well. In fact, thank you for the whole presentation. Do you think there could be a circumstance in which a Christian could have a dialogue with God and say, I really would like to be released from life, could you endorse that? Or is that an impossibility as far as we understand Christian theology? Because I'm kind of, I'm not considering suicide. But in a general case, do you think that that kind of endorsement by God for one of his faithful servants who really sought that endorsement could actually get it?
Well, it's a very good question, thank you. And there are some Christian people, including some prominent Christian leaders, who are saying they've changed their minds. Historically, Orthodox Christian theology has always been opposed to suicide and has always seen that as an act of despair and hopelessness. And interestingly, Orthodox Christian theology has always distinguished between martyrdom and suicide. So martyrdom is to give your life because there's something even more important to give it for. You're doing it to bear witness to Christ, you're doing it in some other way. You don't intend to die, you intend to bear witness to Christ, but you recognize that in so doing you may die. Suicide is to destroy your life because there's nothing worth living for. And in Orthodox Christian theology, martyrdom is an act of hope and faith and love, where suicide is an act of despair and hopelessness. So if you think of the suicides in Scripture, such as King Saul or Judas Iscariot, their suicides are initially seen as a godly act of witness. They're seen as acts of despair and hopelessness. So I don't think there's any example of a suicide that is regarded as a sort of noble. The closest thing you get is Samson. Samson's an arguable case. But what is interesting to me is that suicidal thoughts are actually quite common in God's people, and they're quite common in the narrative. So Elijah says, "It is enough, Lord, take my life." But God doesn't say, "Okay, sign the form, here it is." Instead, he gets sent off on a sabbatical, and he's got more to do. And Job curses the day he was born, and Jeremiah and others, display suicidal thoughts. But they are not seen as therefore off you go, quite the reverse. So it seems to me that suicidal thoughts are common in God's people, but that doesn't mean to say that suicide itself is a godly way. And yes, I can imagine myself coming to the point and saying, I'm tired, I'm old, my wife has died, I've got terrible arthritis, I want to die, God. But I can also hear the Almighty say, but how do you know I haven't got more things to teach you? And how do you know I haven't got more things for you to teach others? And maybe in that dying process, dying well, certainly what Cicely Saunders and people like her, and what I've seen myself, is that unlooked for but strangely wonderful dying process can actually be incredibly intense and valuable. And I've seen relationships restored in those last few hours and minutes. I've seen wonderful things that can happen on the deathbed. If you kill yourself, you short circuit all of that.
I take all that on board, but what I'm getting at is if somebody comes to you and says, I have had this dialogue with God, and he has said it's okay. For someone to turn around and sort of deny God the option to say that ever is a pretty heavy thing, isn't it?
Well, except, of course, in Orthodox theology, we understand that God has the right to take life, and God does take life.
Right.
If God has decided my life has ended, I'm not going to get back to London. That is different from deciding.
Sorry, there must be plenty of people who have prayed and said, God now, and he's answered their prayer.
You don't know, do you?
Well,
They don't hang around to tell you.
But maybe it,
Yeah. But there's a beautiful little couplet of poem, doggerel, which comes from the era of when people used to ride horses. And of course, it was a very common thing to die coming off a horse at speed. I mean, it was, and it says, between the saddle and the ground, he mercy sought and mercy found. Bang. So it makes the point again that you just don't know what none of us know. But I think in Orthodox Christian thought we don't have the right to take your own life, because as much as anything, it isn't your life to take.
So we had.
So you've referenced a number of Catholic theologians, but have somehow managed to dodge the question of contraception so far. I just don't think it's fair that anybody talking about life and death gets to dodge the question of contraception.
Okay.
We have your thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, sure. So it is one of the distinctions between Catholic theology and Protestant, Orthodox Protestant theology, is our understanding of contraception. So in Catholic understanding, so first of all, so it seems to me in creation theology, making love and making babies belong together. It's not an accident that the way human beings make babies is also the most intimate and profound physical way they have of expressing intimacy between a man and a woman. It's not an accident that a baby comes out of that relationship. That's actually part of creation order. So in creation design, making babies and making love belongs together. Now the Catholics go on and say that means, because of that creation order, that every single act of sexual intercourse must be open to the possibility of making a baby. And they argue for that, not on the lines of biblical theology, but on the lines of natural theology, that this is what nature intends and you're frustrating nature. The problem with that view, so therefore Catholic theologians say, in practice, it's okay to use the rhythm method, and even to go to very sophisticated techniques of measuring temperatures and checking salival mucus and all the rest to avoid having a baby. But what you mustn't do is use condoms or contraceptive pills and so on, which which led to the rather brilliant quip that Catholics are allowed to use the science of mathematics, but not the science of physics or the science of But so the problem with that, from a Protestant point of view, is that if you're using the Ridley method, it's pretty clear what your intention is. And yet, why should that be different from using a common law? So in Protestant thinking, what theologians call the unitive and the procreative aspects of marriage, they say yes, they belong together within the marriage. Within the marriage as a whole, making love and making babies belong together. So in Orthodox Christian thought, for a married couple to say, well, we really love one another and we love having sex, but actually we make terrible parents and I don't fancy it at all, and we're not going to have any children. We're just going to make lots of love. Interestingly, in Orthodox Christian theology, that would be seen as selfish and inappropriate, because making love and making babies belongs together. But it doesn't mean to say that every act of making, so that therefore within the context of the marriage, in Protestant thought, it may be appropriate. There are times where it's appropriate to have a child, times when it isn't. There's then the whole issue about whether contraceptives work by causing failure of implantation and whether that's morally significant and so on. And that's another huge can of worms, which I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not trying to duck it. I just think there's all kinds of technical debates that go on there. Happy to talk to you afterwards if you're interested.
That's the one where I meet the speaker.
We'll go to Erin and then we might need to make this another question.
Thanks very much for your talk. I'm not sure if this is true or not, but I had heard that in some hospitals there's actually a weight limit for when they will actually put some, I guess, medical effort into saving premature babies, and that's sort of this weight setting is the decision that's made. If they're above it, then they will make effort to save them. If they're below, I'm just curious if that's the case in your hospital, and then if so, how does that impact on sort of your ethical stance in terms of practicing medicine?
Thanks. It is true that in some health systems that kind of arbitrary limit is imposed, but I always argue strongly against that, and we don't have any such limit in our hospital. Basically because it seems to me that the decision of whether to resuscitate a baby or not is very much an individualized decision, which needs to be taking all the clinical factors into account, which includes weight, but many other variables which are also very important. And also it needs to be taken in collaboration with parents, so that we try to make this a collaborative decision together. And of course that means you try and have this decision before the baby is born. Even if it's only half an hour before the baby is born, you try to sit down and talk through all the possible pros and cons and the uncertainties, and then make a decision of what you think is in this baby's best interests. That does mean sometimes that with a heavy heart, I've made the decision not to resuscitate. Sometimes parents have pleaded with me to start resuscitation, and sometimes I have started resuscitation and then made the decision to stop later on when it seems that it isn't working. So again, every decision, I think, needs to be individualized, but in the end, we're trying to do what's best for each individual baby.
Okay, so thank you, John. We've made you work very hard, and I think it's time for cake.